My sister Hannah's voice carried across the wedding reception like nails on glass as she raised her champagne flute for her maid of honor speech. "And here's to my sister Caroline," she announced with theatrical pity, gesturing towards where I sat alone at table 12 near the emergency exit. "Our family's little security guard who's been playing soldier for 6 years now." The crowd of 200 guests laughed as she continued her performance. Caroline thinks wearing a uniform makes her important, but we all know she's just the family disappointment who couldn't handle real responsibility. My cheeks burned with familiar humiliation as relatives nodded their approval of Hannah's cruelty. But then, something unexpected happened. Her new husband, Captain David Morrison, suddenly stood up from the head table, his face white with shock. He began walking directly toward me across the crowded reception hall, and what he said next would shatter every assumption my family had made about my military service and change everything forever. The humiliation began 6 years earlier, on a rain-soaked October morning in Arlington National Cemetery, where we had gathered to bury our father, Colonel James Mitchell. The funeral had been a masterpiece of military precision, with honor guards and flag ceremonies that honored his 30-year career as an Army intelligence officer. But even in death, my father's legacy had become another weapon my family used against me. I stood in my dress blue uniform at the graveside, the silver oak leaves of my major's rank catching the gray morning light. At 28, I had already achieved more in my military career than most officers accomplished in a lifetime, but my family saw only what they wanted to see, the daughter who had disappointed them by choosing service over their suburban expectations. My sister Hannah stood beside our mother Margaret, both dressed in expensive black that screamed designer grief. Hannah was 31, a successful marketing executive whose life revolved around appearances and social climbing. She had always been everything our mother wanted in a daughter: conventional, commercially successful, and utterly devoted to the kind of lifestyle that impressed neighbors at country club gatherings. As the honor guard folded the American flag that had draped our father's casket, I felt the weight of a family legacy that had shaped my understanding of duty and service. Dad had been a decorated intelligence officer whose work had taken him to classified locations around the world, and his stories about strategic operations had inspired my own military career. But my mother had always resented the military for taking her husband away from family gatherings and social obligations. In her mind, military service was something that men did out of necessity, not something that ambitious young women chose when they could have comfortable civilian careers. The flag ceremony concluded with the presentation to my mother as the surviving spouse, a moment that should have honored our father's service, but instead became another reminder of my exclusion from family priorities. As the honor guard handed her the folded flag, she glanced at my uniform with barely concealed disapproval. After the graveside service, our family gathered at the house in McLean, Virginia, where relatives and friends shared memories of Dad's life and service. I moved through the reception in my dress uniform, accepting condolences and sharing stories about his influence on my military career. But every conversation was an opportunity for my family to reinforce their narrative about my disappointing life choices. "Caroline joined the Army right after college," my mother explained to family friends with the tone of someone discussing a terminal illness. "We keep hoping she'll come to her senses and find a real career, but she seems determined to play soldier indefinitely." The phrase "play soldier" was delivered with surgical precision, designed to diminish 6 years of military service to the level of childhood games. I had learned to absorb these casual cruelties without reaction, but they accumulated like small wounds that never quite healed. "Maybe she'll meet a nice officer and settle down," suggested my Aunt Patricia with the kind of hopeful concern reserved for family members whose lives had gone off track. "Caroline is so focused on her little Army assignments that she doesn't make time for real relationships. Caroline thinks wearing a uniform makes her important, but she's basically just a glorified security guard." The comparison to security work was particularly effective because it suggested that my military service was essentially civilian employment dressed up with military pageantry. My family had convinced themselves that my job involved checking ID cards and walking around military installations, rather than anything that required actual expertise or responsibility. What they didn't know was that Major Caroline Mitchell wasn't checking ID cards at some remote army base. I was a military intelligence officer specializing in psychological operations and strategic deception, with security clearances that allowed me to brief senior Pentagon officials on classified operations that shaped international policy. But my work required maintaining cover stories that protected operational security, which meant I couldn't correct my family's misconceptions without compromising classified information. So I listened to their dismissive assessments while coordinating intelligence operations that prevented terrorist attacks and disrupted enemy networks worldwide. The breaking point came during Hannah's toast at the funeral reception, when she stood beside our father's memorial display and addressed the assembled friends and relatives. "Dad always said that service meant sacrifice," she began, her voice carrying the practiced emotion of someone comfortable with public speaking. "He sacrificed time with family to serve his country, and we were proud of that sacrifice because it meant something important." She paused to look directly at me, her expression shifting to something approaching pity. "Caroline thinks she's following in Dad's footsteps with her Army career, but there's a difference between real military service and whatever it is she does at those desk jobs. Dad was an officer who made decisions that mattered. Caroline, well, Caroline checks badges and files reports." The room fell silent as relatives processed this public assessment of my military career. Some nodded with understanding, accepting Hannah's explanation for why my service was somehow lesser than our father's. Others looked uncomfortable with the direct comparison, but no one challenged her characterization. I stood in my dress uniform, feeling the weight of decorations that my family couldn't understand and achievements they would never acknowledge, and realized that this moment would define our relationship forever. After the funeral reception, my mother pulled me aside for what she called a serious conversation about my future. "Caroline," she said with maternal concern that masked deeper disappointment, "I think it's time you considered leaving the Army and finding a real career. You've had your adventure, but you're approaching 30 and you need to think about marriage and stability." "I am thinking about my career, Mom," I replied carefully. "I'm up for promotion to Lieutenant Colonel next year." "Promotion to what?" she asked with confusion. "Caroline, you're not actually going anywhere in the military. Women don't become real officers. They become assistants to real officers. It's time to be realistic about your limitations." The conversation revealed everything about how my family viewed military service and women's roles within it. They believed I was playing dress-up in a system designed for men, pretending to have authority and responsibility that would never actually be granted to someone like me. "Besides," my mother continued, "Hannah is getting serious with that Army captain she's been seeing. David Morrison seems like a real officer, someone who might actually have a future in the military. You don't want to embarrass the family by pretending to be something you're not when there's going to be real military personnel at family events." The comparison to David Morrison was devastating in the implications. Hannah's boyfriend was a real officer, while I was someone pretending to be something I wasn't. My mother had decided that my 6 years of service were somehow less legitimate than his conventional military career. "David commands a company, 150 soldiers who depend on his leadership. That's real responsibility, not whatever administrative work you do." I listened to this assessment while reviewing classified briefing materials for a psychological operation that could prevent a 3-way war in Eastern Europe. My operational security required me to appear exactly as my family believed, an unremarkable support officer whose work contributed nothing meaningful to national defense. Over the following months, my family's treatment shifted from dismissive to actively hostile. They had decided that my military career was an embarrassment that needed to be managed rather than supported. Christmas dinner became an opportunity for extended lectures about realistic career planning and understanding your limitations.
My mother invited successful female professionals to family gatherings, apparently hoping that exposure to lawyers and marketing executives would convince me to abandon my military phase. Hannah took particular pleasure in explaining to friends and relatives why my Army career wasn't progressing as expected. "Caroline's been a major for 3 years now," she would say with fake concern. "Most officers either advance or get pushed out, but she seems to be stuck at the same level indefinitely. I think the Army is trying to let her down gently." The truth was that my promotion to lieutenant colonel had been delayed by security reviews required for officers with my level of classified access. The background investigations necessary for higher clearances could take years to complete, but my family interpreted the delay as evidence of professional failure. Meanwhile, Hannah's relationship with David Morrison was progressing exactly as my mother had hoped. He was a conventional infantry officer with a solid record and clear advancement potential. More importantly, he fit my family's understanding of what military officers should be: male, traditionally masculine, and unambiguously successful. "David's being considered for promotion to major," my mother announced during one family dinner. "His battalion commander specifically mentioned his leadership potential. It's so refreshing to see someone who takes military service seriously." The implicit comparison to my supposedly stagnant career was clear. David was advancing because he was a real soldier, while I remained stuck because I lacked whatever qualities the Army valued in its officers. What my family didn't know was that I had been promoted to lieutenant colonel 6 months ago, but the promotion was classified due to my assignment to a joint task force that officially didn't exist. My work involved coordinating psychological operations with CIA and NSA assets, missions that required complete operational security. I was also being considered for promotion to colonel, which would make me one of the youngest female officers to achieve that rank in military intelligence. But those achievements were buried under security classifications that prevented me from defending myself against my family's casual cruelty. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to my apartment in Alexandria with a formal engraved card that announced Hannah's engagement to Captain David Morrison. The ceremony would be held at the historic Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., followed by a reception for 200 guests. I was invited, but the invitation came with specific instructions about my attendance. "Please understand that this is David's first major social event with our family," my mother explained in a phone call. "We need you to dress appropriately and avoid anything that might embarrass Hannah or David." "What does that mean?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "No uniform," she said firmly. "This is a civilian wedding, not a military ceremony. We don't want you confusing people about your role in the Army or making David uncomfortable by pretending to be something you're not." The instruction was delivered with maternal authority that made disagreement seem childish. I was being told that my military service was inappropriate for polite company, that my uniform represented some kind of deception that needed to be hidden from my sister's new husband. "Mom," I said carefully, "my uniform represents 6 years of service to my country. It's not a costume." "Caroline, you're not a real officer," she replied with exasperated patience. "You work in an office on some Army base, checking papers and filing reports. David commands soldiers in combat situations. There's a difference, and we don't want you embarrassing the family by pretending otherwise." I listened to this assessment while reviewing classified briefing materials for a psychological operation that could prevent a 3-way war in Eastern Europe. My operational security required me to appear exactly as my family believed, an unremarkable support officer whose work contributed nothing meaningful to national defense. The wedding planning continued over several months, with my role carefully managed to minimize my visibility and impact. I wasn't included in the bridal party or asked to participate in any meaningful way. My mother made it clear that my presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. "We're seating you at table 12, she informed me during one planning conversation. "It's near the back, close to the exit, so you won't be in the way of important guests." Table 12 turned out to be where they seated +1s and distant relatives who needed to be included but not prominently featured. The message was clear: I was family by technicality only.
Hannah's attitude toward my attendance was even more pointed. During one family dinner, she made her expectations crystal clear. Caroline, I know you mean well with your little army thing, she said with sisterly condescension, but David's military friends will be at the wedding. Real officers with real careers. Please don't embarrass me by trying to talk about military service with people who actually understand it. The phrase little army thing reduced 6 years of classified operations to the level of a hobby that I had gotten too serious about. Hannah was warning me that my presence at her wedding would be an embarrassment that she was graciously choosing to tolerate. But the most devastating conversation came 3 weeks before the wedding, when my mother called to discuss final arrangements. Caroline, I need you to understand something important about the reception, she said, with the tone of someone delivering difficult news. Hannah is going to make some remarks about family during her toast, and she might mention your situation. My situation? Your failure to advance in the army despite all the opportunities you've been given. Hannah thinks it might help other young women in the family understand the importance of realistic career planning. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I processed what my mother was saying. My sister was planning to use her wedding reception as an opportunity to publicly humiliate me, to use my supposed military failure as a cautionary tale for other family members. Mom, I said quietly, maybe I shouldn't attend the wedding. Don't be dramatic. Family is family, and Hannah wants you there. Just try not to react too strongly to whatever she might say. She's trying to help you understand your limitations. That phone call took place in my classified office at the Pentagon, where I was coordinating psychological operations that spanned 3 continents. On my desk were briefing materials for operations that could reshape international politics and prevent thousands of casualties. But in 3 weeks, I would sit at table 12 while my sister used my supposed failure as entertainment for wedding guests who didn't know that the family disappointment outranked most of the real officers they respected. The irony was perfect. While my family planned to humiliate me for my lack of military achievement, I was being considered for promotion to brigadier general, which would make me one of the youngest female general officers in United States Army history. But that promotion was classified, and the operations that qualified me for it were buried under security classifications that made my achievements invisible to the people whose approval I had spent my life seeking. In 2 weeks, I would walk into that wedding reception as Major General Caroline Mitchell, though only a handful of people in the world knew that rank existed. My family would see what they had always seen, the disappointing daughter who had never lived up to her potential. The woman they planned to humiliate was about to discover exactly what kind of officer she had been dismissing for 6 years. The Willard Hotel's grand ballroom was a monument to old Washington elegance, with crystal chandeliers casting warm light over 200 wedding guests who represented the best of military and civilian society. Hannah had spared no expense in creating the perfect backdrop for her social triumph, and every detail screamed success and sophistication. I arrived wearing a simple navy dress that I had chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention. My mother's instructions about civilian attire had been clear, and I had no desire to create drama that would overshadow Hannah's moment. But as I approached the reception entrance, I was reminded immediately of my place in the family hierarchy. Name? Asked the hostess with professional courtesy, consulting her guest list with practiced efficiency. Caroline Mitchell, I replied, watching her scan the alphabetized names with growing confusion. I'm sorry, I don't see a Caroline Mitchell on the list. Are you sure you're on the correct guest list? My stomach dropped as I realized what had happened. In all the wedding planning conversations, no one had bothered to ensure that my name was actually included on the official invitation list. I'm the bride's sister, I said quietly, hoping to resolve the situation without creating a scene.
The hostess looked skeptical but consulted with her supervisor, who eventually located my name on a handwritten addition to the original guest list. It was clear that I had been an afterthought, added to the list only when someone realized that excluding the bride entirely might create questions. Table 12, she said finally, pointing toward the back corner of the ballroom where a small table sat near the service doors and emergency exits. I made my way through the elegantly dressed crowd, past tables of military officers in their dress uniforms and civilian guests who represented the peak of Washington society. The contrast between the prominent seating arrangements and my assigned table was impossible to miss. Table 12 was occupied by distant relatives and plus ones who had been invited out of obligation rather than affection. The conversation was polite but stilted, consisting mostly of comments about the venue and speculation about the cost of the wedding. From my vantage point near the back of the ballroom, I watched Hannah work the room like an accomplished social performer she had always been. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of designer craftsmanship, and she moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and basking in the attention that came with being the center of such an elaborate celebration. David Morrison stood beside her in his dress blue uniform, his captain's bars and infantry insignia marking him as exactly the kind of officer my family respected. He was handsome in a conventional military way, with the confident bearing that came from commanding soldiers and being recognized for his leadership abilities. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that my exile to Table 12 was just the beginning of a systematic campaign to minimize my presence and impact on the wedding celebration. When servers began distributing champagne for the toasts, I noticed that Table 12 received a different vintage than the rest of the ballroom. While other guests sipped Dom Perignon, we were served a standard champagne that was perfectly acceptable, but obviously inferior to what the important guests were drinking. The dinner service followed the same pattern. Other tables received elaborate presentations of filet mignon and lobster, while Table 12 was served chicken and salmon that appeared to be from a different catering menu entirely. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Even at her own sister's wedding, I was being treated as a second-class family member. But the real humiliation began when Hannah rose to make her maid of honor speech. She stood at the head table with practiced poise, her champagne flute catching the chandelier light as she surveyed the ballroom filled with guests who had come to celebrate her perfect wedding with her perfect military husband. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible day with David and me." The crowd settled into attentive silence as Hannah launched into what appeared to be a standard wedding toast about love, commitment, and shared futures. But I could see something in her expression that suggested this speech would be more than simple celebration. "Marriage is about finding someone who complements your strengths and supports your dreams," she continued, looking lovingly at David before her gaze swept across the ballroom. "David and I are both committed to excellence in everything we do. He serves our country with distinction as a company commander, leading soldiers with the kind of courage and competence that defines true military leadership." The praise for David was effusive and public, establishing his credentials as a serious military professional worthy of respect and admiration. But I sensed that this buildup was designed to create contrast with what was coming.
Family is also about supporting each other's achievements, Hannah said, her tone shifting slightly as her eyes found me at Table 12. Which brings me to my sister, Caroline, who's here tonight despite her busy schedule. The pause before busy schedule was filled with barely concealed mockery, suggesting that my absence from family events was due to self-importance rather than actual responsibilities. "Caroline has been playing soldier for 6 years now," Hannah continued, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom as 200 guests turned to look at the sister she was discussing. "She wears a uniform and works at some army office doing, well, we're not entirely sure what she does, but she takes it very seriously." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd as guests processed this public assessment of my military career. Some of David's fellow officers looked uncomfortable with the direction of the toast, but most of the civilian guests seemed entertained by Hannah's family commentary. Caroline likes to think of herself as our family's little security guard, she said with theatrical affection that couldn't mask the cruelty underneath. She's very dedicated to her important work of checking identification badges and filing reports. We're all very proud of her commitment to administrative excellence. The laughter grew louder as Hannah's description painted me as a delusional support worker who had confused bureaucratic employment with actual military service. Every word was carefully chosen to diminish 6 years of classified operations to the level of office management dressed up with military pageantry. But tonight is about celebrating real achievement, Hannah said, raising her champagne flute toward David, about honoring the kind of military leadership that actually matters. David commands real soldiers in real operations, making real decisions that affect real lives. The contrast was devastating and intentional. David's conventional military service was real, while my classified operations were implied to be fantasy or self-deception. So here's to David and Hannah, and to understanding the difference between playing dress-up and actually serving your country with distinction. The ballroom erupted in applause as guests raised their glasses to toast the happy couple. But the real message had been delivered. I was the family embarrassment, whose pretensions to military importance provided entertainment for sophisticated wedding guests. I sat frozen at table 12, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes as relatives and strangers processed Hannah's public assessment of my worthlessness. The humiliation was complete and expertly crafted, designed to establish forever that I was the disappointing sister whose delusions about her own importance had become a family joke. But as the applause began to die down and guests prepared to resume their conversations, something unexpected happened. David Morrison, who had been smiling and accepting congratulations throughout Hannah's toast, suddenly stopped mid-gesture. His face went white as he stared directly at me across the crowded ballroom, his expression shifting from polite attention to what looked like recognition mixed with absolute horror. He stood up abruptly from the head table, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. Every eye in the room turned toward him as he began walking directly toward table 12, his military bearing evident in every step. "David," called Hannah after him with confusion and growing alarm, "where are you going? We haven't finished the toasts." But David wasn't listening to his new wife. His entire focus was directed toward me as he crossed the ballroom with the determined stride of someone who had just realized they were in the presence of someone whose identity they had completely misunderstood. As he approached table 12, I could see recognition dawning in his eyes. The captain who had been accepting praise for his military leadership was processing the reality that he was about to encounter someone whose service exceeded his own in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He stopped directly in front of my chair and came to attention with the precision that marked a professional soldier. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as he raised his right hand in a perfect military salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying across the silent reception hall with unmistakable respect and something approaching awe. "Major General Mitchell, I had no idea you were Hannah's sister." The words Major General Mitchell hit the ballroom like artillery fire, each syllable destroying another assumption the wedding guests had made about military hierarchy and family relationships. "Please," he continued, his salute still held in perfect position, "forgive my wife. She doesn't understand who you really are and what you've accomplished." Caroline's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical if they weren't so devastating to witness. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which transformed into horrified comprehension as she processed the reality that her new husband was saluting the sister she had just finished publicly humiliating. "Major General?"
she whispered, her voice barely audible across the silent ballroom. David, what are you doing? My sister isn't a general. She's barely even a real soldier. But David wasn't listening to my mother's protestations. His attention remained fixed on me as he processed the magnitude of his error in allowing his wife to mock someone whose service exceeded anything he had ever imagined. Ma'am, he said to me directly, you saved my life in Kandahar province in 2018. I was Captain Morrison, Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 508th Infantry Regiment. You were the intelligence officer who coordinated the psychological operation that convinced the Taliban to surrender their position rather than fight to the death. The specific operational details began filling in the picture for the military officers present, several of whom started to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a family dispute. Operation Silent Thunder, I confirmed quietly, watching David's face as he remembered details that had been classified for years. 18 soldiers came home alive because of your psychological operations, David continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth he had been unable to share for years due to operational security. Around the ballroom, other military officers began to recognize the significance of what they were hearing. Psychological operations that prevented conflicts without requiring combat were the kind of strategic achievements that marked the most skilled intelligence professionals in the military. Colonel Peterson, one of David's former commanders who was attending the wedding, stood up from his table and approached our conversation with growing understanding. General Mitchell, he said with professional respect, I reviewed your promotion packet when you were considered for Brigadier General. Your psychological operations have shaped doctrine across multiple combatant commands. The revelation was systematic and devastating, each piece of information destroying another element of my family's carefully constructed narrative about my military failure. Ma'am, David continued, I need you to know that Charlie Company has talked about Silent Thunder for years. You're legendary among infantry officers who understand how psychological operations can achieve strategic objectives without casualties. He turned to address the stunned wedding guests, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded soldiers in combat. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the silent ballroom, this is Major General Caroline Mitchell, one of the most decorated intelligence officers in the United States Army. Her psychological operations have prevented conflicts and saved countless American lives.
The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the hotel's air conditioning system cycling in the background. 200 wedding guests stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment as they processed information that completely overturned everything they had just heard about my supposed military failure. Hannah remained frozen at the head table, her perfect wedding reception transformed into a public education about the difference between conventional military careers and classified operations that shaped international security. The promotion to Major General, Colonel Peterson added with professional pride, makes General Mitchell one of the youngest female general officers in Army history. Her advancement through the intelligence ranks has been unprecedented. My mother looked like she was about to faint as she struggled to reconcile the daughter she had dismissed for 6 years with the general officer who was being honored by experienced military leaders. But she told us she was just a major, my mother said weakly, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom. She said she worked in an office checking papers. Operational security, I replied simply, standing to address my family directly for the first time in years. My actual rank and position are classified. The cover story was designed to protect intelligence operations that could be compromised by public knowledge of my involvement. I looked around the ballroom at the wedding guests who had just witnessed my public humiliation, then at my family whose cruelty had been exposed in front of the military and civilian leaders they had hoped to impress.
For 6 years, I continued, you've treated me as an embarrassment whose military service was somehow illegitimate. You've mocked my achievements, dismissed my dedication, and made it clear that you considered my career a failure. David stepped forward with obvious discomfort. Ma'am, if I had known who you were, I would never have allowed— You didn't know because you weren't supposed to know, I interrupted, with the authority that came from years of commanding classified operations. But your wife's assessment of my service has been clearly stated. She believes I'm a security guard who plays dress-up in military uniforms. Hannah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Caroline, I didn't know. If I had understood— You would have treated me exactly the same, I replied with clinical precision, because your contempt wasn't based on my rank or achievements, it was based on your need to feel superior to someone. I looked around the ballroom one final time, at the military officers who now understood they were in the presence of someone whose service exceeded their own, and at the civilian guests who were processing their participation in the public humiliation of a general officer. Congratulations on your marriage, I said to Hannah with formal politeness. I hope you'll be very happy together. As I walked toward the ballroom exit, David called after me with desperate urgency. General Mitchell, please, let me apologize for my wife's behavior. She didn't understand the significance of your service. I stopped at the ballroom doors and turned back to face the man whose life I had saved through psychological operations he had never fully understood. Captain Morrison, I said with the authority of someone who outranked him by several levels, your wife understood exactly what she was doing. She chose to humiliate someone she believed was powerless to respond. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of who she was actually dealing with. 6 months later, I was promoted to Lieutenant General and assigned to command the Army's Psychological Operations Command at Fort Bragg. The promotion ceremony was classified, attended only by officials with the highest security clearances, but the appointment made me the youngest female 3-star general in Army history. Hannah sent a handwritten apology letter that I didn't read, along with a request to rebuild our relationship now that she understood my perspective. I donated the letter to my classified files without opening it. My mother made several attempts to contact me through official military channels, apparently believing that my promotion had somehow vindicated their years of dismissive treatment. Her messages went unanswered because I had finally learned that the only approval worth seeking comes from people who understand what excellence actually costs. Standing in my command office at Fort Bragg, coordinating psychological operations that shaped international politics and prevented wars, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone whose true value had finally been revealed under the most devastating circumstances possible. My family had spent 6 years proving their character when they thought I was powerless. Now they could spend the rest of their lives living with the consequences of that demonstration. I was Lieutenant General Caroline Steele Mitchell, and I had finally stopped pretending to be anything less than extraordinary. Sometimes the people who should support you the most are the ones who hurt you the worst. If you've ever been mocked by family who couldn't see your worth, if you've ever had to hide your achievements to avoid toxic dynamics, if you've ever chosen duty over approval, share your story below. In this community, we honor those who serve in silence and find their validation in excellence rather than recognition.